Yo, happy October. You do know what October is, right? It's ADHD Awareness Month. And in the spirit of it being ADHD Awareness Month, I thought that today I would cover something that comes up a lot. And that is getting diagnosed later in life with ADHD. And a lot of people just reach out to me saying, I just got this diagnosis. I don't know what to do about it. I don't know how to navigate this thing. I don't know anything about medication. And a lot of folks are still in that journey of actually getting diagnosed, but suspect that they have it. So, fun fact, the rate of adult diagnosis of ADHD has more than doubled since 2020. Now, we all know what happened in 2020. No need to go back there. But what would make that year specific in terms of this increased rate of diagnosis? Because that was the year when everybody's life, all of our structure and routines and habits got upended, and we had to recreate life from scratch. Well, a lot of us did anyways. And one thing to know about ADHD is that it's really hard to make transitions, either long-term transitions like we all had to deal with over the course of the pandemic, but also small transitions that can happen at any point in the day, like turning off your computer and transitioning from work brain to home brain, or transitioning from what you're looking at on a screen to your little kid who's trying to get your attention. That task switching is really difficult for ADHDers. So you can see now why 2020 was the big reckoning for adults with ADHD to finally get that diagnosis. Now, there's a lot of ways that folks come to a late in life diagnosis. Number one, people are becoming more educated about ADHD through social media and people just sharing their experiences. And when they see that, they recognize themselves in it, and then they go and seek a diagnosis. And then in the second camp, a lot of adults with children are finding that their kids are getting diagnosed with ADHD. And then as a result, they're starting to realize that a lot of those behaviors came from them. And if you didn't know, if you have ADHD, there's up to a 70% chance that you might pass that along to your children as well. Now, there's different opinions around the heredity of ADHD. So I'm going to park that for now, and let's just focus on what to do if you are diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. And I will cover this from my own perspective of being someone who is diagnosed in their 50s, and also from all of my ADHD training and the ADHD adults that I have coached who have come to me with this, I have no idea what this is or what I'm doing question. And I think there's no better way to kick this off than with an actual question I got from a reader. And she writes, can you cover something about first diagnosis along with depression? You cover so much from your own experiences, which is really helpful. And a lot of posts out there seem to treat it like a parody, almost like a lighthearted condition, which we may be able to get to, but initially there's a lot of overwhelm and some sadness. Not sure if there's anything you can do with that, just trying to learn and work it all out. All right. Who can relate to that, reader? If you have been diagnosed with ADHD, there's a good chance that you have also been diagnosed with comorbid conditions, meaning you might also have been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, OCD, autism, a host of other diagnoses that you also have to navigate in addition to ADHD. I can only speak from my own experience. What I will say is that when you are first diagnosed, that feeling of initial sadness is extremely common. When I got off the phone with the psychologist who had just wrapped up my testing and called me to give me the results, I definitely shed a few tears. Even though I've been going through the testing process for a couple of months, and I knew in my heart and soul that I had it, to the point where I had already signed up for ADHD coach training because I knew that was the path I was going to take to heal from this, I still had those moments of sadness for that little girl who grew up thinking that she was just stupid, that there was something wrong with her and she was fundamentally flawed. I also felt sadness at the fact that both of my parents have passed on, and I would have loved to have said to them, this is what I had all along and we just didn't know. At that point, there was a genuine sadness, and there still is a sadness for that little girl who could have had a different path if she had have known what she was up against. But I'm also not one to dwell on the past because there's nothing we can do about it. So I very quickly turned my attention to what can I do about it now? And as I mentioned, I immediately signed up for an ADHD coach training, mostly because I had already been coaching for several years in the context of fitness, and I wanted to evolve my coaching practice into something that was more mind-body. So this was the perfect opportunity for me to use one of my greatest strengths, which is love of learning, to dive in and learn everything. So that is how I dealt with it. You might need to deal with things differently, have conversations with people in your family. You may not even want to share it with others at first. You may want to keep it to yourself until you feel okay with the reality of the situation before you start to share it with others. And even then, you want to be very careful about who you share it with, because Everybody has an opinion, right? So accept that there will be some sadness, and that is totally okay. And give yourself the grace and space to mourn what could have been. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, you don't want to get stuck in that space for too long because that can create a victim mindset. And it's really hard to grow or heal or move forward if you're feeling sorry for yourself. So give yourself the grace and space to mourn, but then move on as soon as you can. And if you need support coming to terms with the diagnosis, this might not be the best time to engage an ADHD coach. I honestly think if you're dealing with a lot of emotion around the diagnosis, get yourself a good therapist who is trauma informed and has some idea about ADHD who can help you navigate your feelings so that you can face them and move on. The second thing I recommend doing is educating yourself around what ADHD truly is and how it's different from depression, anxiety, or anything else you may have been diagnosed with. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is really a misnomer because it's not that we have a deficit of attention, it's that we have dysregulated attention. And because of that, it has a tendency to impact our executive function. Your executive functions are in the front of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, and they are responsible for the following functions: planning and organization, emotional and behavioral control, I call this self-regulation, working memory, personality, problem solving, attention, social skills, flexible thinking, and conscious movement, which, said another way, conscious movement is proprioception, meaning that you are aware of where your body is in space. So if you find that you're a very clumsy person and you tend to run into things, which I do, that means that you struggle with proprioception. Now, there's other things that go beyond that list, like time blindness, disorganization, being messy, forgetting things, losing things. The list goes on and on. And then different researchers also have different takes on executive functions. For example, Dr. Russell Barkley, who is a very prominent researcher in the field of ADHD, breaks the executive functions down into 4 categories, which is nonverbal working memory, which is basically being able to maintain data in your head as you're thinking through problems. So, for example, if you struggle to do long division in your head, as I absolutely do, then that's what you would consider nonverbal working memory. He also talks about internalization of speech, which is verbal working memory, self-regulation, which again is being able to regulate your energy, attention, and mood and behaviors according to what's appropriate in the moment, and reconstitution, which is planning and generativity. So as you can see, there's a lot of behavioral impacts as a result of these executive function issues. But here's the thing I want you to take away initially. Number one, not all ADHD is the same. So the executive functions that you struggle with are not going to be the same ones that I struggle with. I struggle mostly with organization and planning, social skills, and working memory. I don't struggle with is being messy or being late. And that is because I also have anxiety. And I find that I can manage my anxiety a lot better when my environment is clean and I am hyper conscious of the passage of time. So that is how it shows up for me, but it's going to be different for you. So I want you to think about ADHD in the context of all of the executive functions and know that just because your ADHD doesn't look like the same ADHD that person on TikTok has, doesn't mean that you don't have it or that yours is worse or better. It's just different. The other thing to know is that it has nothing to do with how smart you are. So if you have grown up thinking that you are just not very smart or that you're not academically inclined, I want to share an analogy I heard from Dr. Russell Barkley that I think illustrates this beautifully. The prefrontal cortex and your executive functions come into play when you want to use the knowledge that you have. But the knowledge that you have is not actually in the prefrontal cortex. It's stored in the back of your brain. And when you have ADHD, it's almost like a meat cleaver goes through the middle of your head this way and disconnects everything you know and all of your intellect with the way you actually know how to use that intellect, which is why ADHDers have this profound sense of knowing that they were meant for more and that they're not reaching their potential. That is because we are actually very smart and all of our wisdom back here is just bubbling up and wanting to express itself. But because we struggle with executive functions, which is the way we express and use all of our knowledge and wisdom, there's a disconnect. So we know we have the knowledge, we just struggle to actually implement it. And here's the good news about that. A lot of our executive functions develop in childhood. And when you have ADHD, they often develop slower than a neurotypical child. And even a neurotypical's executive functions are not fully developed until about the age of 26. So most ADHDers are even slower to develop all of those executive functions, and even then might have some impairment. And I'm sharing that with you because here's the thing, you absolutely can continue to develop your executive functions over the course of your life. Your brain has so much elasticity, meaning that you can start to connect new neurons between your executive functions and your knowledge back here, and eventually get that meat cleaver out of your head so that you can express everything that's in that big, beautiful brain of yours. It just takes time, patience, and self-awareness. So my recommendation for you is to start learning about ADHD, start learning about all of the executive functions, and identify the ones that are the biggest struggle for you. And then start working on strengthening it. And that can be mental acuity skills that you build inside your brain, things you do to improve your memory or your focus or your attention. Or it can be things that you do externally in your environment to support that lack of executive function. So one of the game-changing things I have found externally to help me with my short-term memory and also with my planning and organization skills is to use Notion. I built out an entire digital infrastructure in Notion to support my ADHD. I will link it below if you're interested and you're already a fan of Notion. But if you're not a fan of Notion, you might want to find productivity systems or ways of doing things that work for you. This is where you want to throw out all of the neurotypical, unsolicited advice that you've heard over the years, like just use a calendar. Just write things down on a to-do list so you don't forget. And if things were that easy, then nobody would have ADHD. But clearly, it's a little bit more complex than that. But it's up to you and only you to take charge of this diagnosis by understanding where your executive functions are getting in your way and either finding systems on your own to accommodate for them or hire the help of an ADHD coach to help you figure that out for yourself. Now, before you start researching ADHD, there's something I want you to know, and it's really important. As you go down this path of learning about ADHD, maybe you sign up for group coaching or you read a few books or you follow all of the ADHDers on TikTok, regardless of what path you go down, I want you to be mindful of the information that you're taking in. Always ask yourself, is this making me feel more hopeful or less hopeful about my diagnosis? I can tell you from experience, as you start to bring in all of this information, even the most well-intentioned, seasoned experts can relay information in a way that can make you feel devastated about this diagnosis or so overwhelmed that you don't think you can ever get past it or live a happy, fulfilled life. And I want you to become aware of that every time you come across information about ADHD. Ask yourself, does this information make me feel more hopeful or less hopeful? Does this information give me something that's actionable that I can try and use? Or is it reinforcing a narrative that if you have ADHD, your life is screwed? Because I don't know about you, but I never want to hear that I can't grow or improve just because I have ADHD. So what you're always going to hear on this channel, for example, are strength-based solutions for you to learn how to thrive with ADHD. I will never leave you in a pit of despair, feeling bad about who you are. Now, having said that, I don't believe in toxic positivity. I don't believe that this is necessarily a gift because a lot of people struggle with it. But I also don't believe that it is going to ruin your life. There is absolutely ways to manage ADHD and actually get the most out of it. I will refrain from calling it a superpower, but it can have benefits, and I prefer to focus on the benefits rather than the things that make it sucky. So that's what you're going to get here. And I understand my content's not for everyone, just like other people's ADHD content is not necessarily for me. It's up to you to find the people that you most resonate with and that are most helpful for you and the way you want to navigate this diagnosis. Now, the last thing I'm going to share for those of you who are newly diagnosed, because I get this question a lot, is around medications. Now, again, I am not a health professional, so it is not for me to tell you what the right medications are or are not. But what I want to address is a question I get a lot, and that is, how do I deal with the stigma around taking medication? Some folks are reluctant to take ADHD meds because of the stigma, and some folks take ADHD meds but are ashamed to tell anyone because of the stigma. So, if you are in that latter category, first of all, obviously you don't have to share your medications and your personal medical records with anyone. That is absolutely your business. And in no way, shape, or form should you have to divulge that information. However, if you are somebody who is concerned about the stigma around medication, to tell you, I don't think there's as much of a stigma as you might think. There are people out there who probably don't think ADHD medication is a good thing, and they are free to think that belief. But that doesn't mean it's a stigma. I think we've actually come a long way, especially in recent years, about the role that mental health plays in our well being and how medications can be incredibly helpful for that. So, if you are afraid to try medications because of a stigma, I would ask yourself, is that stigma actually true, or is it really just a story you're telling yourself based on some unchecked beliefs within your own heart? Because I openly share that I do take ADHD medication and I don't care who knows it. I don't have any embarrassment or shame around it. And I don't think anyone else should either if they're taking it. They've helped me enormously. Will I take them for the rest of my life? I have no idea. But for right now, they're super helpful and I have no shame around that whatsoever. So if there's a stigma out there, I'm not aware of it. And if the people in your life are imposing their unwelcomed opinions on you, if you can, maybe it's time to change those people in your life or just don't share this with them. This is entirely your business. That's what I have for you today. If you're somebody who's newly diagnosed, then I hope this was helpful. Or if you know somebody who's newly diagnosed, feel free to share this video with them. There's a lot that I could say about this, and I will continue to build on this series over time. But I just wanted to start with a few initial steps that I think are really important when you're first diagnosed. Give yourself time to grieve, learn about executive functions, pay attention to the information you bring in, and always be asking yourself, does this information make me feel less or more hopeful about my diagnosis? And last but not least, if you want to explore medication, talk to your healthcare provider. And if your healthcare provider is the one who has the stigma around ADHD medication, then it's time to find a new healthcare provider. I hope that was helpful, guys. And for those of you newly diagnosed, welcome to the club. ADHDers are some of the most kind, amazing people out there. So that includes you too. And on that note, I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.